Imagine the audience disappears, not gradually all at once, every person whose opinion of you has ever shaped how you walked into a room, what you said, what you wore, how you edited the account of your day before offering it to anyone who might judge it. Gone. No one watching, no one measuring, no social media, no reputation to manage, no version of yourself being witnessed by anyone whose assessment you care about, just you, alone in the quiet of your own company. The question, simple, direct, a little unsettling, is this: who are you now? Not who do you want to be, not who are you trying to become. Who are you right now in this moment when there is nothing to perform and no one to perform it for? What do you think about? What do you reach for? What does your mind do when it is not managed, not directed, not shaped by the presence of anyone whose expectations are worth meeting? Who is the person that exists in the hours no one will ever hear about? This question matters more than almost any other question available to you, because that person, the unwitnessed one, the private one, the one who shows up in the small hours and the long afternoons and the ordinary moments that no one is recording, that is the actual you. Not the constructed one, not the performed one, the one beneath all the layers of impression management that modern life has made so constant, so automatic, that most people have largely lost the ability to feel the difference between the two. This audiobook is about finding that person again, or perhaps for the first time. It is about what solitude and silence teach when they are not fled from, about what character actually means and where it is actually built, and about why the most important work you will. Part 1. The PERFORMED Life, How We Lost Ourselves in the Audience. The sociologist Irving Goffman, writing in 1959, described human social life in terms borrowed from theater. He called it dramaturgy, the theory that everyday social interaction is a kind of performance in which individuals manage the impressions they make on others. The way an actor manages a role, we have front stage behavior, the version of ourselves presented to audiences, calibrated for their expectations, and backstage behavior, the version that exists when the curtain comes down and the performance is suspended. Goffman was not being cynical about this. He was being accurate. Social performance is a fundamental feature of human life, not a flaw in it. The question he was asking was not whether we perform. We always have. But what happens to the self when the distinction between front stage and backstage begins to collapse? That collapse is the defining condition of contemporary life. The smartphone in the pocket means the audience is never more than a tap away, which means the performance is never quite over. Social media has created environments in which the backstage barely exists, where the meal is photographed before it is eaten, where the sunset is documented before it is felt, where the emotion is named and shared before it has been fully experienced, where the self is curated and published in real time, and the curation, practiced constantly enough, begins to feel more real than what it curates. The philosopher Charles Taylor has written about what he calls the social imaginary, the background understanding of what is normal, what is expected, what it means to be a person in a particular cultural moment. The social imaginary of the present moment includes, for the first time in human history, the expectation that the self is something to be broadcast, that a life fully lived includes its documentation. That experience is somehow incomplete until it has been witnessed and responded to by an audience, however small, and this expectation absorbed without examination by everyone who has grown up inside it, is doing something to the private self that we are only beginning to understand. When the self is primarily experienced as performance, the backstage does not become richer, it becomes unfamiliar, uncomfortable. The silence that should feel like rest begins to feel like absence. The solitude that should feel like restoration begins to feel like a problem too. Be solved by filling it with noise. And the person who lives this way long enough may find that they have lost contact, quietly and without noticing, with the backstage self entirely. That there is no longer a clear distinction between who they are and who they are trying to appear to be. That the performance has become, in some disorienting way, the only self they have easy access to. This is not a moral accusation. It is an observation about structure. The environments we inhabit shape the selves we develop, an environment that is essentially always on, always witnessed. Always performing produces over time a self that is always performing, and a self that is always performing is a self that has almost no opportunity to discover what it is when it is not. Which is precisely the discovery this audiobook is about. Part 2. The Terror of Solitude and What It Reveals. In 2014, a research team at the University of Virginia conducted a series of experiments that produced one of the most discussed findings in recent psychology. Participants were asked to sit alone in a room for between 6 and 15 minutes with nothing to do except think. No phone, no reading material, no music, just their own company. The majority found this profoundly uncomfortable. A significant proportion in some conditions, 2/3 of the men and 1/4 of the women, chose to administer mild electric shocks to themselves rather than continue sitting in silence with their thoughts. They chose physical pain over being alone with their own mind. The finding was widely reported as evidence that people hate being alone with their thoughts. But the more interesting interpretation is what it reveals about the relationship most people currently have with their inner life. Not that the inner life is painful, though for some people at some times it is, but that it has become, for many, simply unfamiliar. The mind that has been continuously stimulated, continuously occupied, continuously pointed outward at screens and notifications and the ambient noise of connection. That mind does not know how to rest in itself, does not know what to do in the silence, and the discomfort of not knowing is experienced as the discomfort of the silence itself, rather than as the discomfort of a skill that has not been developed. Blaise Pascal, 3 centuries before smartphones, observed that all of humanity's problems stem from the inability to sit quietly in a room alone. He was pointing at something architectural about the human mind, its restlessness, its movement toward distraction, its resistance to the unmediated encounter with its own contents. What is different now is not the restlessness that is ancient. What is different is that the tools for avoiding the silence have become so powerful, so available, so socially normalized that the avoidance has become the default rather than the exception. And the silence, when it arrives uninvited, feels like something has gone wrong, but nothing has gone wrong. The silence is simply waiting, as it has always waited, with everything it has to offer, which is, in the end, nothing less than yourself, the unmanaged, unperformed, unwitnessed self that exists in the quiet and that has, if you have been running from it, been waiting patiently for a very long time to be met. The contemplative traditions have always known this. Every major spiritual and philosophical lineage that has taken the inner life seriously has insisted, in its own language, on the necessity of silence and withdrawal, not as escape from life but as the condition for understanding it. The Quaker tradition of sitting in shared silence, the Buddhist practice of meditation as the sustained examination of the mind by itself, the Benedictine monasticism of ora et labora, prayer and work, each in its proper silence, the Stoic practice of the evening review, the daily return to the private self to examine what it has done and what it has become. All of these traditions recognize something, that the connected, performing, always-on world is in danger of forgetting entirely that the self requires silence the way the body requires sleep, not as a luxury, as a biological and psychological necessity. Part 3. What character actually is and where it is built. The word character comes from the Greek charactera, a mark engraved on a surface. Something pressed in, something that leaves a lasting impression, and in its psychological and philosophical usage, character refers to exactly this, the stable, enduring qualities of a person that persist across different contexts, across time, across the varying pressures of circumstance. The person of good character is not merely someone who behaves well when it is observed. They are someone for whom the behavior and the observation are essentially irrelevant to each other, who is the same person in private that they are in public, whose actions when no one is watching are consistent with the actions they would choose to be seen performing. This is the ancient definition, and it is demanding in a way that the modern conversation about values and self-improvement rarely reaches, because it locates the whole of character in the unobserved, not in what you say about yourself or what others say about you or the reputation you have carefully cultivated across years of managed impression, in what you do when you are alone, in what you reach for when there is no reward for reaching, in what you say to yourself, in the interior conversation that no one will ever audit. Aristotle, who thought more carefully about character than perhaps anyone before or since, called it ethos, the habituated disposition to feel and act in particular ways, not a quality you have, a quality you become through practice, through the accumulated weight of choices made consistently in the same direction, until the direction is no longer a choice, but a nature. Character for Aristotle was not what you believed. It was what you did, especially when no one was watching, especially when the easier path was available, especially when the cost of integrity was paid in private, and the reward, if any, arrived in a currency no one else could see. This is why the unobserved hours matter so much, because character is not built in the moments when virtue is rewarded and visible. It is built in the moments when virtue costs something and no one will know whether you paid it. The private commitment honored when breaking it would have been easy and invisible. The standard maintained when the only person who would have known about its abandonment was you. The quality of attention brought to work that no one will scrutinize. The honesty of the internal conversation when the comfortable lie would have served just as well. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who had been a slave and understood better than most the limits of external control, taught that the only thing truly within a person's power was the quality of their own inner life, their judgments, their intentions, their response to whatever circumstance produced. This was not a consolation for powerlessness, it was an identification of where real power lives, in the private, in the unobserved, in the self that no one can take from you because it is not given to anyone else to manage. The freedom that exists in solitude is the freedom of the only domain that is entirely yours, and the character built there is the only character that cannot be performed away. Part 4. What the silent mind discovers. There is a quality of thinking that is only available in silence, not the productive thinking of directed problem solving that can happen in noise, in motion, in the midst of a busy day. Different kind, the kind that does not move toward a predetermined destination but wanders, makes unexpected connections, surfaces things that the directed mind, always moving toward the next required output, does not have the patience to wait for, the kind that is less like working and more like listening to the mind itself, to what is actually present beneath the noise, to the slow arrival of understanding that cannot be forced and will not be rushed. Neuroscience has begun mapping the substrate of this experience, the default mode network, the system that becomes active when the brain is not engaged in directed external tasks, is not, as was once assumed, simply idling. It is engaged in some of the most complex and important processing the brain performs: self-referential thought, the integration of memory and future planning, the processing of social and emotional experience, the generation of the narrative of selfhood that gives continuity and meaning to a life. These processes require the absence of competing demands. They require, in a word, something approaching silence. The research on insight, the sudden arrival of a solution or understanding that has resisted direct effort, consistently shows that insight most frequently occurs not during focused work, but in moments of relaxed, undirected mental activity: the shower, the walk, the quiet before sleep, the moment of stillness between tasks. These are not interruptions to the thinking. They are often where the thinking actually happens, where the connections form, the patterns emerge, the thing that was just out of reach finally arrives. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote about what she called attention, a quality of inner stillness and receptivity that she considered both rare and sacred. She distinguished it from effort. Attention, she argued, is not the straining of the mind toward its object. It is the suspension of the mind's own noise, an agenda long enough for what is real to make itself known. It cannot be forced. It can only be created by the removal of what crowds it out, by silence, by the willingness to not know for long enough that something other than one's own preconceptions has a chance to arrive. What the silent mind discovers is not always comfortable. In the absence of distraction, the things that have been waiting in the queue, the unprocessed emotions, the avoided questions, the grief not yet felt, the decision not yet made become audible. This is precisely why so many people avoid the silence, not because the silence is empty, but because it is full of what has been waiting, sometimes for years, for enough quiet to finally be heard. But what comes in the silence is not only difficult, it is also illuminating: the creative solution, the understanding of what you actually value beneath what you have been performing as valuable, the clarity about what needs to change and what is worth keeping, the recognition of the person you have been and the honest confrontation with the person you want to become. All of this is available in the silence. None of it is available anywhere else in quite the same form, because none of it can be found by looking outward. It can only be found by stopping long enough for the looking to turn inward. Part 5. Becoming someone you respect in private. There is a question that I think is more useful than almost any other question available for the honest examination of a life. More useful than what do I want to achieve, more useful than what do other people think of me, more useful than am I happy, though all of those questions have their place. The question is this: am I someone I respect when no one is watching? Not a demanding, perfectionist version of that question, not the question of whether you are flawless in private. No one is, and the expectation is its own kind of performance, but a genuine, honest, unsentimental version. When you are alone, when you are in the unwitnessed hours, making the small choices that no one will audit, treating yourself and the world around you with whatever quality of attention and care you actually bring when there is nothing to prove, is that person someone you recognize as yourself, someone whose choices you can sit with, someone who acts at least approximately in accordance with what they claim to value? For many people, honestly answered, the gap between the private self and the public self is larger than they are comfortable acknowledging, not because they are hypocrites, not in the simple moral sense, but because the private self has been so much less cultivated, so much less attended to, so much less consciously shaped than the public one. The public self has had years of investment, the careful attention to how it presents, how it speaks, how it handles the situations where it will be observed and judged. The private self has often been left to form by default, to become whatever the path of least resistance produces when there is no audience to perform for. Marcus Aurelius kept a journal, 12 books of private writing that were never intended to be published, that were, as far as we can tell, written for no audience except himself. In those pages, the Emperor of Rome interrogated his own behavior with a directness he could not have brought to any public forum. He noted where he had fallen short, where he had been lazy or irritable or less than the person he intended to be. He returned again and again to the same handful of principles, not because he had mastered them, but because he had not quite. Yet the journal was the practice of private accountability, the daily, unsentimental examination of the person. He was in the hours when no one was watching. This is the practice available to all of us, not the journal necessarily, though the journal is one of the most reliable tools for the kind of honest self-examination that the private life requires, the practice of turning the same quality of attention to the private self that most people reserve entirely for the public one, the practice of asking regularly and without flinching, not what did I achieve today, but who was I today, in the moments no one saw, in the choices no one will know about, in the quality of my own inner life when it was left to its own devices. The philosopher Iris Murdoch wrote that the foundation of morality is not the big dramatic choice, the moment of crisis that tests character publicly. It is the quality of attention brought to ordinary life, the countless small acts of seeing clearly, responding honestly, treating what is in front of you with the care it deserves, not because anyone will notice, but because you notice, because the self that performs those small attentions is being, moment by moment, in exactly those attentions built, not declared, built, in the private, daily, unwitnessed practice of being whoever you choose to be when there is no one there to choose it for. The closing. The audience will always be there. The performance will never entirely disappear, nor should it. The social self is a real part of who you are, and its cultivation is not inherently inauthentic. But it is not the whole of you, and a life lived entirely in the front stage, entirely in the performed and witnessed and curated, is a life that has lost something that cannot be recovered by any amount of external achievement or public approval. What it has lost is the backstage, the private, the unobserved, the self that exists for no reason except that it exists, that moves through the quiet hours not as a character in anyone else's story but as the only character in its own, the self that thinks in the silence and discovers in the solitude and builds, in the unwitnessed choices of ordinary days, the only thing that will still be there when every audience has gone home. Character, the mark engraved by the accumulated weight of who you chose to be when no one was watching, the only version of yourself that belongs entirely to you, that was not built for anyone else and cannot be taken by anyone else, the person you become in the silence. The Stoics had a practice they called the evening review, a daily, private accounting of the self to itself, not for anyone else, not for publication or reputation or the approval of anyone whose opinion mattered, for the simple, fundamental purpose of knowing who you actually are, of seeing yourself clearly enough to move tomorrow slightly closer to the person you intend to be. That practice is available to you tonight, and tomorrow night, and in every quiet moment between now and the end of whatever time you have, not as a burden, as the most honest conversation available, the one between you and yourself, in the silence with nothing to prove and no one to perform for, and the whole, rich, unwitnessed truth of your life waiting to be seen, go into the quiet, see who is there, and then in the choices that follow in the private hours that belong to no one else, in the unwitnessed moments that are, in fact, the whole of your life. Become someone worth meeting there. No one is watching. That is not a reason to do less. It is the only condition under which the most important work can finally be done.